The U.S. is facing rising consumer prices and supply chain problems. Americans are seeing increasing costs for food, energy, and housing. Between 2020 and 2021, milk prices have risen around 18 cents per gallon for conventional whole milk, and the price of 100% lean ground beef is up 39 cents per pound. These are two staple items for many households. Americans are also seeing higher prices at the gas pump. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reveals the average cost of gasoline per gallon has risen over $1 since last year. Americans are also finding it more expensive to buy a home. The cost of lumber is up 40%. The National Association of Home Builders says skyrocketing lumber prices have caused the average price of a single-family home to rise by nearly $30,000. And the public's outlook on inflation is at an all-time low. A new survey from New York's Federal Reserve reveals households expect inflation to rise by 5.7% over the next year. This is the highest hike since the survey launched in 2013. Here to break all this down with me is Sarah House, Director and Senior Economist for Wells Fargo's Corporate and Investment Bank. Sarah, welcome. Great to have you with us. So the Consumer Price Index, which measures the average change in prices consumers pay for goods and services, rose 0.4% in September. This includes rising costs in food, energy, and housing. The new CPI report for October comes out tomorrow. What do you expect to see?
So we expect to see another big gain, actually bigger than what we saw in September. So we think that the Consumer Price Index will have risen 0.6% in October, and that would put the cumulative price gains over the past year up at 5.9%. So seeing that inflation picture continue to worsen over the near term before we think that it eventually will get better as we get further into 2022. But for now, it is a pinch on households.
And, you know, it's just curious because there are other indicators in the mix here, right? The October jobs report was fairly strong. Employment rose by over 500,000. So what does all of this tell you about the direction of the labor force, number one, and what this can tell us about the economy when you factor in the inflation?
Well, I think when we look at the inflation picture, one thing that's been underappreciated is the contribution of strong demand to this backdrop. So we've come out of the pandemic era environment with particularly strong spending on goods. It's been difficult for that side of the economy to keep up with demand, and that's really where we're seeing the exceptional inflation environment. And so this gets back to the fact that the economy overall is in a great position. So you mentioned the job market gains that we saw in last Friday's report. So we're continuing to add workers back to the payrolls. And so even though inflation has picked up, more and more people are earning a paycheck. And so they're also able to go out and turn around and spend. And so the aggregate picture remains very strong, even if inflation is beginning to eat into some households' purchasing power.
Right. But you do make a really good point that inflation as a product of demand has an upside, correct?
Right, to the extent that it's coming from a strong economy, a strong consumer, that's not, that's not a bad thing. I think when we see that inflation is coming from either shortages or disruptions, and so you're not actually able to consume more, you're not increasing your own utility, to put it in economist speak. That's when it becomes more corrosive. I think also when we get to the point where inflation is so high, it makes it difficult for businesses or households to plan. That's when we begin to see some downside effects. I think overall right now we're still in this extraordinary environment. So coming out of a period where you saw rapid shifts in terms of buying power, we have had some supply disruptions on top of that. And so I think the current inflation environment is fairly unique and related to a lot of the transition that's still undergoing in the economy right now.
And Sarah, the Biden administration is sending a message that there are two bills, one of which is infrastructure, which is heading to the president's desk for signature, and the social spending bill will help lower inflation. Let's listen.
17 Nobel Prize winners in economics have said, spontaneously wrote to me together, and said this will lower inflationary pressure on the economy when we pass my bills. A new analysis from the Wall Street firm of Moody's Analytics found that it will ease the financial burden of inflation for middle-class families.
But Sarah, Republicans are saying that additional government spending could make inflation worse. So without asking you to take sides, which we understand you can't do, what is your take on the president's agenda helping to fight inflation?
Well, I think when it comes to government spending, how it's being spent is very important. So in regards to infrastructure, to the extent that it's increasing the supply side of the economy, particularly at a time when transportation networks are struggling to keep up and don't have enough capacity, that could help in terms of alleviating some of the current degree of inflation. But I think another important thing is really the timing aspect of this. So infrastructure is longer term spending. So we don't go and it doesn't go out the door right away. So these projects have to be planned and started. And so really the fiscal impact of this to the economy is going to be spread out over a matter of years. This is very different than the sort of government spending and transfers that we saw earlier this year, where you had money hitting households' pockets directly. So basically, stimulus checks coming from the multiple rounds of COVID relief hitting household bank accounts almost immediately to where they could spend it. This is a very different sort of timing in terms of when it actually hits the economy and therefore that inflationary impact.
Absolutely. Well, Sarah House, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Thanks for having me.